Hello all, I hope you are doing well in these unprecedented times. I'm going to keep using that word because it's clearly not used enough in the mainstream media. Welcome to the Fintech Finance Virtual Arena where we're hosting you today. Today I am joined by Sanjib. How are you doing, Sanjib? All good, all good?
Doing well here. Thank you, Ali, for having me on here. Really excited to be part of this.
Whereabouts in the States are you at the moment?
I'm actually in Fairfax, Virginia, so not too far from Washington, D.C.
Excellent. Yeah, that's going to be very interesting in the next few weeks, I have to say.
The center of everything.
Well, I'm very glad you said that, because what we're going to be looking at today, we're going to be taking a bit of a deep dive in, well, first of all, we've got to talk about Money 2020 and MoneyFest, but also we've got to talk about the US market, especially some of the opportunities and lessons learned and vice versa from the European market.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that sounds great.
Well, off the bat, I mean, it's been, my heart has gone out to you guys at Money 2020, but MoneyFest seems to kind of be building up and getting a bit of a solid buzz around it. What exactly is MoneyFest and what can we expect from it?
Yeah, thank you. And it's been a long year for I think all of us, and we weren't able to hold the physical events in Europe or Vegas, but we are able to hold a virtual event, and so that's what we're doing with MoneyFest. And for those that haven't been to a Money 2020, we try to get people across industries, companies large and small, regulators, investors, everyone all together to try to create a community to help figure out what's going to be in the future and to help build what's going to be in the future. And I think to the extent possible, we're building that with MoneyFest. We've got amazing speakers from leaders from companies that are going to be talking about some fairly provocative things, and going to be talking a little bit about the challenges of this year as well as how they've overcome them, and what might be on the horizon. And additionally, another big part of Money 2020 is, for example, Ali, when we met at Europe, last year, I definitely miss being able to, shake hands and give you a big hug. But, we won't be able to do that virtually, but, we'll be able to interact virtually because for holders of 2019 passes as well as 2020 pass holders, we're going to have virtual networking as well too. So you're going to have an audience of people that are really interested in the topics that are covered at Money 2020. And the best of all is it's free. It doesn't require travel. So for those that might have had to figure out, okay, can I fly to Vegas or Amsterdam or not? You don't have to worry about that. Just sign up and be part of it. And we're actually getting great traction. Several thousand have already registered. We're at several thousand more every week. So it's going to be at scale too. So I think we're very excited about it.
Absolutely. Here's the thing about not just the actual pandemic itself, but all the knock-on effect, particularly around some like the government stimulus that's been happening all around the world, is payments have been such a vital part of people's infrastructure. I mean, the likes of Chime in the US, effectively saying, if the stimulus package, we'll be able to get it to you early. And it seems kind of ironic that events like Money 2020 are very much needed right now, but have to kind of go ahead on a virtual level.
Yes, no, that's a great point, and I think that with having been part of it from the early years, 8 years ago, it was a crazy idea then, and now it's gained traction. It's sort of become a little bit of mainstream thinking, and in terms of like engaging regulators, in terms of getting folks that in the past might have been a bit wary of trying something new. I think that's sort of the norm now, and like you said, it's needed more than ever right now.
Absolutely. One of the things I love about Money 2020 is when partly the travel, but also when you go to certain places, like for example Vegas or Singapore, and you learn about other payment methods. You learn about kind of some of what different people are doing in different parts of the world. With that in mind, let's talk about Europe, the US, and Asia. What from your perspective, what are some of the biggest difference when it comes to payments in terms of really in terms of the approach to it.
Yeah, no, that's a very astute point. And so I almost let me go to the markets themselves. Like, so the U.S. is it's a much more homogenous market. Your single regulatory regime, consumer attitudes are probably more homogenous than the other two. Then you've got Europe, which more heterogeneous, a lot more differences in consumer opinions about credit, for example, or even payments and how they manage their finances. And then you get to Asia, which is even more heterogeneous, where you've got more more developing markets. You've got some very developed markets, and once again, in both Europe and Asia, different regulatory regimes. So I think that one of the things that I've noticed is that the types of things and types of companies that we've seen in Money 2020 USA, for example, they're really focused on like some of the core technologies and the user experiences. And with that, if they can figure out a great user experience, they can scale that across 50 states, fairly much less pain, with much less pain than you might in Europe or Asia, for example. Whereas in Europe, for example, you've got a lot more cross-border types of pain points. You've got a lot more, different types of infrastructure types of issues that might pop up. And then in Asia, it's even more fragmented. So I think that speaks to a little bit of the types of solutions and the types of ways of thinking that innovators have in those markets.
One of my favorite parts we've ever done with some of the payment races that we've done with you guys is, I think it was our second payment race. We went from Toronto to Vegas using only the contactless ring, and there's an amazing video of it just not working on the vending machine. A year later, I think for race 5, wasn't the same vending machine, but it was the same kind of make and model, worked seamlessly, and I was like, this is great, because it's showing that, hey, actually there is that uptake. It is not just happening in the major cities, it's starting to happen in the in-between, in the middle. On the flip side, however, the US is still, you love cash, love a check, love a mag stripe with a big signature. Where do you see all that heading in the US in terms of payment? Are we going to start to see a lot more things like the way that Amazon Go works and slowly kind of phase away from the checks? What's the where do you see it all heading?
Yeah, so I actually, a funny story about the checks. You mentioned it. Like, so for example, we used to have the hackathon where we would award the winners with a lot of money on the big stage. And in the US, we would have these huge checks printed out, to create that show. And the first time that we did the Europe show, and we were like, oh, we're going to print out these big checks, and the Europeans are like, what are you talking about? This makes no sense. And so from a very practical perspective, I mean, that really brought it to the forefront. And I think you're absolutely right. Like especially with contactless payments, especially in the time of social distancing, it's biologically safer to do something contactless rather than having to give cash or a check. And so I think we're seeing a lot more uptake of that in the US. And so I think, that's a case where, Europe has been ahead and continues to be ahead of the US, and we're playing a little bit of catch up. But I think that catch up is happening. And then even in thinking out to Asia, like a lot of these payment experiences are not necessarily tied to a traditional bank account. Whereas even in Europe, even though it might be contactless, it's still tied to a bank account. So and if it's not tied to a bank account, you could do more different types of things. So I think there's a lot of cross-pollination happening, and I think I think you've highlighted it very well. And I think for example, like you mentioned Amazon Go, it's still in my mind experimental. It's not mainstream, and so that's actually something that I agree that post-COVID, I definitely see those types of experiments starting to gain more traction, hopefully becoming mainstream. And then even in Japan, for example, they've been really big on like vending machines for decades. So like, is that a case where something like vinyl records, something old becomes new again too, and we see that the vending machines are the vinyl records of 2021 or 2022.
Absolutely, I have to admit, I love. Anytime I've been to the US, usually at an airport, you have Best Buy as a vending machine. I was like, that's phenomenal. I needed that camera battery, and it's right there.
Yeah.
Big. With that, I mean, there is nothing, and I truly mean absolutely nothing that compares to Silicon Valley. Just in terms of unicorns and innovation, and every time I've been there, even just walking around, you kind of feel, yeah, there's shit's happening here. Why do you think that Europe's never developed a similar region? I mean, every European country tries to say, yes, we want to be the Silicon Valley of Europe. Why do you think that's never really happened in Europe? And what lessons can we learn from Silicon Valley?
Yeah, so that's actually a very I started off my career in Silicon Valley, in Northern California. So I've had that personal experience. And actually, Jake, who's too shy to be speaking right now, but he actually recently spent some time in Silicon Valley too. So I think we'd both be able to speak to a little bit of our experiences there. And I remember as a recent grad getting out of college, hanging around the barbecue with my friends, and we're talking about the pluses and minuses of various computer operating systems. I mean, that's quite a geeky conversation. We're not talking about football. We're not talking about news. We're talking about operating systems. We're talking about chips and computer chips, not potato chips. And so I think it's a draw for people that are really into that this field. And just thinking back on it, like that there were the companies that were there. Like, so for example, I worked at Intel, Hewlett Packard, and all these other, older guard companies that were there. Then you had colleges like Berkeley, Stanford, and San Jose State, that also provided recent grads new ideas and in actually a lot of the muscle to help make these things happen. And then you have capital, from VCs, and then you have a bit of that craziness. And so, between the companies, the colleges, the capital, and the craziness, it was, that's the recipe for what my experiences were at Silicon Valley. And I've since moved out of Silicon Valley many years ago, and you're even in areas where people are really into it, but it's not as all-encompassing. And there's pluses and minuses with that. And so I think that in Europe, for example, like in Berlin, London, Paris, there are definitely places that have really started to build that critical mass, and even places you might not expect, like Lithuania, for example, with their e-residency and being at the forefront of enabling new thinking. I think that those are very interesting experiments, but it takes a bit of time, and I'm sure, like when you speak to for example, even like in Scandinavia, like for example, like when Skype had the big exit, then you start to create Skype alumni and that go on and help start up other things. So I don't know. It's hard to pinpoint, and hopefully once again, Jake's too shy to talk about it, but those are my points.
Cool. With that in mind, whenever going on Wikipedia and looking up banks in any country, there's always a big 3, big 4, big 5 in every country in the world. In Canada, the US, Uzbekistan, it doesn't matter. There tends to be that establishment. Where do you see the banking market in the US at the moment, and where do you see it heading? Because obviously there's big shout out to the guys at Varo for getting their banking charter a few weeks ago. So there's obviously quite a lot of opportunity there that newcomers can enter the market. So how do you see kind of being on the ground there in terms of how on the retail side consumers are viewing banks?
Yeah. So that's actually a very transformational question, and I think that's so not to talk about MoneyFest again, but for example, Brian Brooks, the head of the OCC, will be speaking at MoneyFest, and I sort of have an inside scoop into what he's going to be talking about, and I think it's going to be fairly transformative. But like, and that also leads to how Varo got their charter, and sort of new thinking about what is a bank, what should be a bank, and what should be under various regulatory regimes, and the reason that has implications for consumers is that consumers want to know that if they use a certain service for their money, that it's safe, that it's under certain security regimes, and that it is it's going to do what they expect, and there's not going to be a switcheroo. And I think even like disruptive fintechs, a lot of times, having been at that side of the table multiple times, you just want to know what the rules are. You want to know what can I do, and even if it's not exactly the best set of rules, as long as I know the rules and how a small fintech can compete against a bank, or how a bank can partner with a fintech. I mean, I think that's the key thing, and providing some clarity around that, I think, is critical. And I do think that that's going to start to happen, because just for example, and this is a case where I think Europe has been at the forefront again too. For example, with like privacy, data privacy. And even open banking and access to data, with things like GDPR, like Europe has been at the forefront, and I think that U.S. consumers, U.S. banks are seeing that, and they're like, okay, how do we? That's actually really neat. What can we do with something like that? And that's why you're seeing something like CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, in the U.S. And so I think that once you have consumers feeling stronger about their privacy and about how their data is being used, then you don't have to worry. Like, so for example, Amazon's one of the most trusted brands right now, but they've had 25-year history of being pro-consumer, of protecting consumer data, and similarly Apple, I'd almost say is in that similar vein. With some of these regulatory regimes, you can fast forward that. If the consumer knows that my data is going to be protected, I'm willing to try some of these things and services maybe faster than I might have in the past.
Absolutely. I always find it there is that wonderful narrative that a lot of the mainstream press quite like, of you've got your Monzos and Starlings in the UK, the David versus Goliath model. But what I personally think is kind of happened in the UK, and again, my own kind of humble opinion, the likes of your Monzos and Starling and Revolut entering the market has made the big banks sit up and go, oh, we better up our game. Otherwise these everyone's going to come for them. They've seen the lessons learned from Kodak and Blockbuster and gone, we need to kind of innovate. And to their credit, the likes of Lloyds and such, they've been doing some phenomenal things. Do you think that the US banks are kind of taking again, it's a cliche, but are taking the threat of your Chime, Varo seriously, and is kind of pushing them to do innovative things and actually to push the boat out a wee bit?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I would say that the U.S. banks, if I think about just breaking that banking market up a little bit, like you've got the big international global banks like like the J.P. Morgans, Chases, JP Morgan Chases, the Cities, and those types of banks that have large organizations already focused on innovation. And I think that they have been taking it seriously, and maybe not as moving as fast as we'd like, but I think the chimes and the varos could be an impetus to help them accelerate what they're doing. Then you've got sort of the next group that might be sort of the mid-sized regional banks, and so in that case, you might have, for example, like their tech providers, like a First Data, or those types of tech enablers to help accelerate what they're doing, because a lot of times they might not have the resources of these larger banks. And then you've got really the small consumer banks, and I think that those are the ones that are going to be most changed, because once again, like they don't necessarily have thousands of people or hundreds of people even looking at that customer experience, and so I think that might be a case where, I personally think that that's going to be a tremendous partnership opportunity for a lot of these new types of banking experiences.
I think that partnership model and mentality, that's how the big banks are gonna truly innovate and survive.
Absolutely, yeah. No, in the early days, the way my way of thinking about it is that the early days of Money 2020, it felt like all the companies, all these startups were like going to the bank saying, "We're going to eat your lunch," and then a couple of years later, it was like, "Can we have lunch with you?" And I think that that's sort of the evolution of how this market will go. And I think, to your point, I think that's spot on.
Looking at, I do want to touch again on these kind of challenges entering the market. There's a lot of, as of last year, there was a lot of VC money zooming around, and there's been some phenomenal ones heard this year. Greenlight, for example, was just last week. And then you've also got some banks like Upgrade as well that are doing phenomenal things, and I personally think are a solid revenue model. Equally, you have some fintechs entering the market, in some cases quite aggressively. Last time I was in New York, everywhere I looked, all I saw was an N26 poster in every kind of, and obviously Monzo is now in the US. Where do you see the market for revenue balancing with that VC money?
Yeah, that's a great and not an easy question.
If you have the answer, a lot of people would love to hear it.
Yeah. I mean, I think ideally you want to, if you're thinking about it like in a quadrant, you want growth and you want profit, and that's what you want. And traditionally VCs have been willing to sacrifice profit for growth, and then, like, if you're looking at, for example, maybe even more of a corporate investor, corporate VC, they're probably maybe that they want to get that profitable model that they could scale into their own existing distribution channels. So I think that there's probably a little bit of and the other thing, and I apologize if I'm going too long with this, but with the pandemic, I think the companies that have been hit the most, the startups that have been hit the most, have been early stage and like late stage unicorns because their valuations from the past have gone down, and then early stage because they're still trying to figure it out and it's hard to make things happen. So that middle is actually, I think, doing quite well. So if you're in the middle, you're going to do quite well. In the early stage, I do think that if you're an early stage entrepreneur, just having a very good line of sight into profitability, even if you're not there yet, and to the extent possible, being able to draw on existing markets and existing areas where there's a long history of fees, for example, being able to develop a sustainable business model. So I think that from an investor perspective, like what I've I mean, the other thing that I've seen is that there's a lot of early stage startups that are doing some fairly innovative things tied to technology that are still getting actually a lot of interest. So it doesn't mean that there's nothing going on there. It just means that if you can distance yourself, you can actually do quite well too. I don't know if that's
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Sanjib, that's been absolutely brilliant. Where is the best place to connect with yourself, and where can we find out more about MoneyFest?
Sure, absolutely. So on Twitter, my handle is paymentalist. I'm also at sanjib@money2020.com if you want to just reach out by email. MoneyFest, to find out more about MoneyFest, please go to money2020.com/MoneyFest. And, hope to see you there virtually. And even more so, I hope to see, definitely Ali, can't wait to see you in person next year, hopefully. And hopefully to your listeners as well, too. I hope to see you in next year live as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. Take care.